Hello, good evening, everyone. It looks good. Audio looks good. I'll put on the camera just in a second here. How's everyone doing? I hope you guys are having a wonderful Father's Day and Sunday in general. I just actually finished a nice, probably 2-hour phone call, roughly, with my own father. It was great. So hopefully you guys are all doing well. We're moving it up today to 6:30 Eastern time. I might play around with the times between 5 and 6 or 6:30. But yeah, I might like this later time. I'm not sure. Okay. So without further ado, let's go ahead and see what the camera looks like. All right. Sounds good. I see a little bit of white blanket underneath that, and that's going to just drive me off the wall with my OCD. So 1 second. Is that better? Yeah, that's much better. Yeah, actually, in my we'll welcome the chat in just a second, but in the conversation I had with my dad, I was telling him about I have not severe, but I would say I have mild to moderate sensory processing, and that's me understanding myself a little bit more. With Professor Geek's daughter who has special needs, and explaining things what she has, and I'm like, I think I have a lot of that myself. And then I was mentioning that to my dad in the conversation. He's like, "Oh, you got that from your dad." I'm like, "Oh, you have sensory processing?" He's like, "Yeah." So basically, he's kind of immaculate as a person. So if there's like clutter on the floor, that to him is like noise, like loud noise. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, this makes so much sense." I don't know if it's hereditary, but anyway. So let's go ahead and welcome the chat. I'm just going to go ahead and post this comment. Yes, you're looking so beautiful, Angel. That's my favorite nickname that the prof has given to me. We're talking about science fiction a little bit today. I mean, probably writing in general. It's going to be a very loose topic, but I'm just going to be talking first from science fiction. But I do have my my Gondor, tree of Gondor, a scion of Neemloth the Fair. So I have a geek-related shirt, but it's not sci-fi; it's fantasy. But hopefully you guys are doing well as well. And let's go ahead and welcome the chat. We have Ghost Planet Max 1.0. Welcome. We've got Brian. Welcome. Big Al, of course. And he says, "Happy Father's Day to all dads everywhere." Yeah, very true. Of course, to Professor Geek as well. Final Fantasy is in. Good. Final Fantasy fan, I should say. And so you guys look like you are all doing well. Private Eye. Daniel Heron, my second channel member. If you want to become a channel member to support my work, it's just $1.99 a month. And you get your comments on screen, unless you say something very salient. Like if you have a really good point, I usually post up your comments. But maybe that will be one of the perks. What I need to start doing is actually having a list of members. Have a screen of channel member names at the end of my videos. I should start setting that up. And probably, I would probably recommend between the name or the YouTube channel. It depends. It depends on what YouTube channels are supporting me. For instance, if there's like some satanic rock band that supports me, I might just like say their names, not exactly their band or whatever. Anyway, that was kind of a sidebar, but yeah, I'm doing well. So let's go ahead and get into the topic. Again, it's a very light discussion today. It's just been something based on things I've noticed. Really, how would I put it? I got to get a swig of water first before I collect my thoughts, or maybe as I collect my thoughts. But I want to talk about not the number one problem I see with contemporary science fiction, but as you know, so if you've been with me long, if you've listened to my videos or even seen recent reviews of science fiction, so I really do like science fiction. I I really have been reading the classics, but I really do want to try for more contemporary science fiction. So science fiction that's been written in the last 5 or so years, something quite new. I mean, I'm currently slogging my way through Hyperion. Hyperion's not a bad book, by the way. I'm just sometimes a week will go by so fast. I'm like, oh, I forgot to read. So I'm the one that's slow with reading Hyperion. And then when I do read Hyperion, it actually reads pretty quickly. I just need to get through it a lot faster. So that was, I think, published in the 80s. So I mean, I'm fine with reading something from the 80s or the early aughts or whatever. But I do want to read more contemporary science fiction. What does science fiction look like today? And that's what we're going to be talking about. Um, and in my exploration of certain books, like how when you go on Amazon and you are looking at a book and then you can see look inside, I actually go to that first thing. Maybe I'll read the premise. And if the premise, like if the little abstract or if the little synopsis is interesting, then I'll go into the look inside and then you can read, a pretty good excerpt, a good substantial part of the first couple of chapters or whatever. And it has to engage me. Like it has to get me interested in the characters and stuff like that. I do that before reviews. As far as fiction is concerned, I actually don't really pay attention to reviews. So even if the book has, let's say the book has like 50 reviews and like 45 of those are 5 stars and then a few of those are 4 stars and 3 stars, that's actually not enough for me to say, oh, I should invest in this book. It's always the writing itself. It's always the look inside option for your Amazon. And if you have me interested, chances are I will click on the purchase with one click button and take it away, and hopefully the book will be great for the rest of the time. But this last week, in addition to reading a little bit of Hyperion, I spent a couple hours this last week going through a couple recommendations. So some people have been recommending current independent author science fiction, and I looked at a couple of them, and for one of them in particular, the idea, well, we'll get into the problem of today's science fiction. What writers should really watch out for, but one in particular had a very good premise. Like I could see myself getting into the story pretty quickly. But there were 2 major problems, and we're going to talk about one big problem. The first major problem was I was not invested in the character. The character was so dry. There was no introspection. It was all boom, 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 sequence, action. Let's get this conflict going. Let's get this started. Let's get this ramped up. I'm like, wait a minute. I don't even care about this character. I don't care if he's in trouble. He was actually on the run by page 3. And I'm like, I don't care. I don't care if he gets caught. I don't care whatever happens to him. I don't care. And because there was just no introspection, it kind of played with this idea that he was kind of a machine more than man. Like everything is very, like the cubicle society, like everyone's doing their own thing. Everyone has a number, not really as far as this book is concerned, but it's like, okay, rank and file. Go, 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 do your work, go home, have a life of luxury, go to work, clock in and stuff. I'm like, okay, that's fine. That's a usual, that's kind of a science fiction trope, until the conflict starts. And I think with this was more like, he's just doing his things just effortlessly. And then he runs into this glitch and is like, oh, that's not my fault. And then he finds that he's on the run. But there was no introspection. There was maybe a couple of cues. There was like, oh, why is my roommate behaving strangely? There's something iffy about him. Oh, well, I just got to do my job and stuff like that. And then something happens and he's on the run and then he has to leave his apartment or whatever. And the action starts ensuing. And I was like, but I don't care. I need some personality. And then he gets pretty much invaded. His mind gets pretty much invaded by this very flirtatious AI. And I'm sorry, like maybe it's because I'm a woman. I'll admit this, guys. It's probably because I'm a woman, but like twice now I've read contemporary science fiction where the AI is this flirtatious female. And I don't mind AIs being female, by the way, piloting a ship or a vehicle or whatever. Um, I actually default to my AIs being male, so maybe that's a gender thing. But when they're immediately flirtatious, like maybe that's a guy thing. Maybe a guy wants to respond to a flirtatious AI right away, but the humor about it to me is so tacky. I'm like, I don't mind the AI being flirtatious if there's been already an established relationship. But when it's immediate and they're like, "Oh, we're going to be like an old married couple fighting all the time." I'm like, you just met. You just met. So no growth, no real development where I can be personally interested in this character. I don't even know what he looks like. I don't know his personality. I was not interested. That was the first problem, but that's not actually the main problem that I ran into with this excerpt of this science fiction. What really slowed my experience, my reading experience down with this particular excerpt was that this writer, I won't mention who it is, but he's an indie author, and I can see absolutely so much potential with this writer. He actually does have a very good knack for writing. He has a good flow in the prose and the narrative and even in the dialogue, even though it's kind of tacky. Um, he has so much potential. Like I could tell he's practiced writing. I could tell he's experienced somewhat. But there were things that were missing because of more editorial reasons. Like maybe he had a couple proofreaders, maybe he's had friends or family or coworkers, read his script and maybe say, "Hey, do this. This can work here." Maybe on the more unprofessional editorial stage, I don't know. Maybe he's had no editorial treatment for his manuscript, but it did show. And with writing science fiction in particular, something that I have really noticed with contemporary writers, like writers that write now and publish books now, is that they really have to go and paint the whole picture of their world for you. They have to paint the cityscapes. They have to paint for you how futuristic the technology is. They have to show you how things are working, what the mode of transportation is, how everything is holograms and everything is holographic and everything is so pristine and so nice. And I'm like, fine, tell me that. Like, I need to know that. I need to know that about your world. But I am fine with just a few sentences. Now, and if you go beyond a few sentences, it has to be because of the character's reaction to the world. So, for instance, I never read this book, but I think it was the case with Harry Potter. The reason why J.K. Rowling could describe Hogwarts for the first time with elaborate detail is because Harry Potter, the character we're following along with, he's seeing it for the first time. This is all a marvel to him. So maybe if you are a character or you're following a character that goes into this beautiful science fiction world, then okay, you have some liberty to describe it a little more than a few sentences. But if the character's been long established in the world and this is just their routine, there's absolutely no reason to go more than a few sentences, a few cues to say what this world looks like. It's only if the character is experiencing something new, even in their established world, even if there's something new to experience, if there's something to combat, if there's a conflict, and then it has to be descriptive. If the character is undergoing something that is not their mundane or their routine, then I would say yes. The writer has a little bit more liberty to describe all that they're seeing. So I have my protagonist of my science fiction. That there's a moment in even the first chapter, within the first few chapters, and they're short chapters, by the way, where she is beholding something of her city or outside her city for the first time. So she's used to what her city looks like or the district in her city looks like. And I don't go more than two sentences so the reader knows, okay, this is what the place looks like. But then she has to travel over something. And because it's not really available to the modern day worker, like the average worker, like it's more accessible to the affluent, it's not commonplace for a normal ordinary person to travel to. So she's seeing this for the first time, and she beholds these things for the first time, and she sees it with media. She'll see it with the news, or maybe she'll see it with magazines or whatever, or maybe a video of the place, but she's never experienced it firsthand what it looks like. Then for something, for experience like that, where it's very new and awe-inspiring, that's where you can actually get a little descriptive. But when someone is doing their, everyday job, I, I don't think it makes sense in the narrative that the world is being described extensively if he's just going to his normal job every day. So it was kind of slowing me down with like, okay, so why are you describing all of this and that? So that's the first thing, is it was just too descriptive. So this goes to the major problem I wanted to talk about on this stream. With science fiction, it's very, very important that you don't describe your science fiction if it doesn't make sense. So as a recap, if it's part of your world, if it's part of your mundane, you really shouldn't go at lengths to describe it, because the person you're following, the character you're following, with their perspective, they're not seeing it like that. There was one point in this excerpt where this guy, this protagonist, was describing all these like neuro holographic displays of stuff like, ships and transportations and shopping places and stuff like that. And the way the author was describing the technology was, and we hadn't had this kind of technology 1,000 years ago. And I'm like, okay, is that not having it 1,000 years ago going to be significant in the future? Because why would you compare your technology from such a distant past if that past doesn't come back again? Now, I'm not saying literally like time travel, but it's like, okay, if the past is not as significant to the plot, why would you make that comparison? I think this is a trip up, or a misstep that science fiction writers of today, they get caught off guard with like, oh, we gotta compare our technology and our world building to modern day 2020 Earth. I was like, you don't have to. And this kind of leads me to the other point I was thinking about, was you really got to trust your readers. You got to trust the readership. If you have readers reading your science fiction, chances are maybe that's their first time reading science fiction. Maybe they're picking up a science fiction book for the first time, but chances are if you have readers for science fiction, they have read science fiction, or at the very least they have seen science fiction. There's a plethora of sci-fi shows out there. Good, bad, subpar, great. We've had decades of science fiction shows. We have had decades of science fiction concept art. We've had decades of science fiction in games now, which means our sensibilities to what futuristic science fiction looks like is pretty high up there. Even if you're not an avid science fiction reader of any science fiction, classic or contemporary, most people understand what futuristic science fiction looks like, having never read a book. So it doesn't really behoove the writer to go into crazy amount of detail about how futuristic this looks. There was even one point in the book or in the excerpt that I was reading, where it was like, it was this sentence. It was, the color scheme was gray and white. I mean, unless that's in contrast to something very important in the plot or the character's experience, I really didn't need to know that. I mean, maybe walk into a dull, you come from the outside and then it's dim with gray and low white light, and then I'll have it. But I don't have to actually know the color scheme. That's an interior decorator. It's like, and that's the thing, is like, I can almost see women falling into this trap if they write science fiction. Like, oh, we got to talk about the color scheme. Maybe one or two color cues, like something that I use for like morning light is like red gold for the morning light in the city, or fuchsia or amber for a sunset, like a beautiful sunset. But I don't go into great lengths of, like, I have to describe. And actually, when after reading that excerpt, I went back to my manuscript. I'm like, "Okay, am I being too descriptive, with my colors here?" So it was way too descriptive, and why I think that can slow the reader down now, today's reader of science fiction is, because people know what science fiction looks like. They've got their Star Wars, they've got their Star Trek, they've got Doctor Who. Uh, I'm not really familiar with Doctor Who, but I know the look of Star Wars and Star Trek, for instance. So that's the first thing. One sec, I'm gonna do something real quick, but need to think, check something real quick. All right. It's awfully warm in here, and I have the dehumidifier on, so I was hoping it was gonna be cooler, but so anyway, that's kind of this is more off the cuff and just my thoughts on my experience reading this. So kind of as a recap, I think that the pitfalls or the traps that modern day science fiction writers can find themselves in is going too much into the world building. With this narrative in particular, with this one excerpt, it was, I've got to show you how cool my world looks. Now, yes, have that as a motive, but don't be so obvious about it. Like, just give me a few cues, do a few more paragraphs with the plot, with the character's interiority if he's alone, have some action, and then a couple more cues of the description, and I'll be fine. And maybe I'm saying this, and maybe you guys disagree. Maybe I'm saying this because I already have a very active imagination. Like, we're reading Darth Plagueis. Professor Geek is doing a book study with Big Al every Friday night, and I'm kind of frustrated because I'm driving home and I'm actually reading this EU book, and I have thoughts, but I can't type while I'm driving. But that's an aside. But I really am enjoying Darth Plagueis, and you know what? The author describes Luceno or Luceno. I forget the author's name. He describes places like the Mune's world just so succinctly and so briefly, and that's all I needed. I know what the world looks like. Even if there's concept art out there that disagrees with my imagination, I know what the world looks like. It was that way with the Thrawn trilogy. I knew what Kashyyyk or Kashyyyk looked like in the Thrawn trilogy based on some very important cues, descriptive cues or descriptors. And then I'm like, fine, that's all I need. That's all I need. Darth Plagueis's laboratory. There was not only it was a lengthy description, but it was the reason why it was lengthy was it wasn't long. It wasn't too long because it described his twisted, mechanical, perverted idea of study and observation to get the Force to bring about immortality. And through that, he's actually torturing life forms. And I knew what that laboratory looked like. I'm like, "Whoa, this is scary. This man is or this being, this Mune is a scary dude." And that was more or less like a paragraph. The Mune world was like a paragraph, maybe a paragraph and a half. I haven't actually seen the book myself. I'm listening to the audiobook. But it was the length was perfect because it wasn't drawn out, and it was just exactly what I needed. So that is, again, going back to the trap, that is where writers today say, no, I have to show you how cool I can make this world. It's like, no, let the readers use their own imaginations. With classic science fiction, it's a different breed because they didn't have the media we have now. They didn't have the video games. They didn't have the modern day cinematography. They, especially in the 1920s and 30s, they had very little to work with. And it was the time when people read as a pastime. So you could actually, like the sci-fi writer of the 1920s and 30s, for instance, or someone like H.G. Wells could really actually divulge a little bit more in the description because there were really it was a limited arsenal of sci-fi media back then. Even in the pulp fiction, even with the magazines and stuff in the 1950s, there was still some limit to what the public had access to. With modern day public online access, like we could just type in a few things and then we are just showered by gorgeous sci-fi concept art and stuff like that. So that is that's what I wanted to say. I think I've said everything I've wanted to say. um Sci-fi writers today don't need to be so descriptive. They need to trust in the imagination of the readers. And please, maybe it's because I'm a woman, but consider female readers in your writing. I'm not saying this as a feminist. I'm just saying I love science fiction. And maybe it's because I have this, I'm more inclined to introspection more as a female. Have some personality and have some cue with your introspection with your characters before going into the action scene immediately, because I just don't care if this person gets caught, by page 3. It's like, okay, whatever. I don't care. So I might be a little bit different that way as a science fiction reader. And then we'll talk a little bit more about science fiction with something else, but let's get into the chat. So hopefully that made sense. That is, that I would say that's the science fiction problem of today, is that it's just too long-winded with the world building. I've been long-winded with my explaining. I accept that, but this is a live stream. This is not a novel. Just, yeah, don't be long-winded with your world building unless it's part of your character's experience. So let's go ahead and see what people are saying. My wonderful prof says, too many beginning authors take a reader's investment in their characters for granted. Yeah, I think that's the way to go. I think the reason for that, my prof, is you're so invested in your story as a writer. You already have personal investment in your characters and in your story as a writer because you love writing what you're writing. And so you're thinking, oh, well, of course my readers are going to be equally invested. And it's like, no, that's the art of writing, is you actually have to work it. It's an art form where you are persuading the reader to be as emotionally invested as you are, or at least a little bit. So I think that's true. Brian Gilmartin says, I've never cared about entertainment reviews myself, even all the way back in the early aughts. Many of the games are considered average. I thought they were pretty great. Yes. I think that's part of the conversation too. Seems like today's writers, you say, have forgotten an important axiom. Brevity is the soul of wit. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, H.G. Wells actually described a lot, but his books are pretty short. Like, The Time Machine was fairly short. Invisible Man, I don't know about War of the Worlds, but Invisible Man, I'm sure, was under 50,000 or 60,000. I'd be surprised if it exceeded that. It just went by so fast. But I could be wrong. Brian also says, writers really need to trust their audiences more than they currently do. No one needs to have each and every detail of your world shouted at them from the rooftops. And I think that's where film and graphic novels and maybe even visual novels now that we have today, I think that's more popular in Japan. That's perfect for that kind of thing. But then it's really up to you trusting that the reader's imagination is going to be fine with taking care of the rest. Is that all the comments? Oh, maybe. Oh, you know what? I think I went down. D. Pensac, welcome. You mean it was sounding like a Marvel movie? LOL. Maybe. Maybe. Yeah, so just kind of in a nutshell, and I actually might, I have this when like a few months back, I did a video on how I read a bad space novel or space opera. And toward the end of the video, I forgot what I had said, so I kind of rewatched it. And then I'm glad I did, because I forgot I had talked about this. But toward the end of the video, I talked about the importance, the absolute importance of getting your manuscript run through and worked through editorial treatment. And the reason for that is we are man, yeah, this is a whole other topic. One second. I'm gonna take a swig of water for this. Um with that space novel, that space opera novel in particular, it was a complete story, and I'll give it that. And there was a flow to the writing. It was an easy read, I'll give it that, but everything else tanked as far as quality. And that novel, unfortunately, was really more a a reaction, like a counter argument to all the ideology that has just destroyed Star Wars, for instance. And the writer himself said on Amazon, saying, "Hey, this is a response," or maybe it was a forward. I read it somewhere in the story. It was a forward in the forward. I'm gonna say it's the forward. I think it was. It was the just the response to how he was so heartbroken what had happened to Star Wars. He's like, "Well, I'm going to write a space opera myself, and it's going to be good, and men are going to be men, and women are going to be women, and it's going to be great." I'm like, "That's fine, but it can't stop there. It has to undergo editorial treatment and progress. You have to have an editor, and the reason for that is if you had, let's say you have a story and you think it's a good story, and it very well may be a good story, but a good story just on its own is just a good idea. It's not art until it serves as an art piece, even a novel. Like a novel is a work of art. And I think people kind of, especially independent, like in the culture we're in where it's all these independent self-publishing books, it's like, well, a novel's just, it can be sensational, or it could be just a response to something, or it's just something I enjoy. And yeah, all that can be factored in. But I would go one up, or one step higher, or one step further, and say, well, no, treat your novel like a piece of art. I mean, yes, me being a composer, I treat music as a piece of art. It's music is an art form. So maybe people don't believe writing is art. Maybe don't people really underestimate, right? Maybe people do underestimate writing. Wanted to say that clearly. Just like speaking, people may underestimate the power and the skill of speaking. Just a sidebar, just kind of what I'm talking about with some applicability. One reason why a lot of YouTube channels do not make it, like people say, "Oh yeah, I'm going to start a YouTube channel," and stuff like that. And by the way, this has nothing to do with the geek community. I'm just knowing this as someone who's observed the entrepreneurial sphere, and people are like, "Yeah, I want to start my business and I want to do YouTube full time and stuff like that," which is a dumb idea, by the way. Don't do it. But the reason why, even after they do so many videos, even if they publish so many videos and they're not getting any traction and any views, I'm sorry. And the content creators who are trying to push them to be their best and stuff like that, they're not telling them one thing. And one thing is they don't know how to speak. They don't know how to be a personality. They don't have any personality in their rhetoric. And then they're like in the form of a discussion, or something argumentative. It's like, oh, here's I'm gonna sound so bad. I'm gonna sound so mean. But like some of these people are just like, I'm gonna show the world I'm baking cookies with my 4-year-old. And that's sweet. I love that. But that's really for Facebook, or that's really for Instagram. That's not for YouTube. Like people go to YouTube to be informed or entertained, or be given some insight, or learning a new skill. That's YouTube, okay? Like YouTube is not a vlog place. Or even if you are trying to talk about something insightful like science fiction, for instance, you have to have a personality. And maybe people will say, well, you're kind of like you're kind of tooting your own horn, thinking you have a personality. I'm like, I don't think that. Only I'm confident in my way of speaking and in my way of instructing is because I've been a teacher for 8 years, and I've had some education before that. So anyway, so speaking is an art, writing is an art. Um, it requires an immense level of skill and practice. And even people with this one guy, even with this writer, I saw so much potential with his story. The idea, the premise was pretty interesting. The world building was even interesting, but I could tell, like, if he got any editorial work, it was very light. So whether that was with a professional or with a relative, it was just the editor, if he had one, did not give him enough. So maybe he is a very gifted writer and he has his ideas very succinct and he can uh, give this flow to this narrative in a pretty effective way on his own. That's perfect. But it would be a masterpiece if he got second professional input. So get your editors, guys, get your editors. If you can't afford it, start with proofreaders from family and friends because they can give you some insight. But then, like as Professor Geek says, like there's it people do underestimate the power of the editor. Even with my science fiction right now, I'm so happy with the structure of my first book. It's on its third draft, and people say you shouldn't have multiple drafts. I'm like, I needed this draft. I'm not going to do any more. There's no fourth draft or fifth draft or something like that. But I'm so happy with the structure of the book. But even so, I sense there's something that I missed or that the reader's not going to pick up that I need to be more clear on and stuff like that. So editorial, get yourself an editor. So anyway, that was a rant as well. All right. Brian Gilmartin says, it's true. People really don't have much of a personality. Yeah. I mean, actually, Professor Geek just dropped a really good video. Don't shut me off for a second. Maybe you can have our videos running at the same time. But this is a live stream and his is a fixed video. And he really talked about the importance of consumerism in our culture. Like it's gotten so rampant because everyone who has spare time, they're just flipping through TikTok videos and stuff like that. And because of that, you don't develop speech. You don't develop a way of speaking. Speaking is so important. And I mean, there are courses for public speaking for a reason. There are courses for speech writing. There are courses and workshops for how to speak effectively to people. And I'm not saying this me speaking is a natural thing as you see me now. It's only been from years and years of teaching and journaling. Actually, I think I've told you guys before, but when I lived in Little Rock, this is like about 8 years ago or something like that, I had thoughts on my writing, on my music, on life in general, and I just didn't want to write my thoughts down because I always wrote like science fiction. So I didn't want to write my thoughts while I was writing fiction. It was just too much writing for me. So I got myself a voice recorder app or whatever, and I just started journaling, like speaking. And I realized after some practice, I really knew that, oh, I know how to voice my thoughts. And unfortunately, when people don't on YouTube, they're not gonna stick. It's sad. You got to practice. I'm a music teacher, you know that. Like practice your speaking. So that was my first thought on some science fiction writing that I've been seeing today quite frequently. There's nothing that has stuck or what am I trying to say? There's nothing so far I've read that has resonated with me. And maybe I'm just a picky reader, but at the same time, I'm like, there are some, dare I say, formulaic things that really hook the reader, keep the reader going. In fact, actually, before I forget, let's see, I think I went off on a tangent. Yeah, like sometimes I go on tangents and then I forget my other thoughts. Oh, in the independent world, so the world of self-publishing, this is so important, guys. I love that we are in a cultural, artistic renaissance for independent artists. It's really good, but you're not going to get a core audience unless you are very, very good with your work or you're an influencer. So if you're an influencer and then you have some mediocre piece of art, then you'll have a following because people follow you and buy your stuff because they like you because you're an influencer. But let's say you're not an influencer. Let's say you have an audience of like 5,000 people or whatever, and you just need 500 people to like read your story. That's where the editor comes in. Um, I think people think loosely like, oh, I could get my book published, and I'll have a following over time, and that's true. It depends on what people want and what people are looking for. But we're long past the days of, we don't have an agency or we don't have an institution where our book can be published effectively and then reach the masses. So what would reach the masses? Guys, it's what Star Wars did. Star Wars and things like Star Wars. It's like, how do you reach the masses? It's like you have to do something of an archetype, and you have to do it masterfully. And that's the way you're going to have your piece with a little luck too. There's some luck involved. That's how you would have your piece stick. It's not just like, oh, I'm just willy-nilly just publishing stuff, and I'll get better at this later. Wanted to mention this point too. Every single book has to stand on its own. Every single book, every single issue of a comic story, every single graphic novel of a series, every single book. So let's say you have a trilogy you want to write, or a 5-part story, like a story with 5 short books or something like that. Every single book has to stand on its own and be merited as high quality. So, for instance, you cannot say, or you can't expect your readers to say, well, I didn't like the first book, so maybe I'll like the second book because the writing is better, because the writer had practice, because they practiced the first book. No, no. The writing of the first book has to be superb. And then it has to raise stakes for the second book, then the third book. And then it has to be that beautiful, 3-act structure. It's like, okay, so hypothetically, like a film trilogy, would you? Maybe some people would. I don't know. I'm not inclined to watch a whole film trilogy if the first movie tanked, in my opinion. Let's say, like, I haven't actually seen this franchise, so I don't know why I'm even giving this example, but I remember seeing a long time ago, the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie. Never saw the subsequent films. Um, but like, can you imagine, like, that got so much raving reviews. Like, everyone, from what I can remember, everyone loved Jack Sparrow. Everyone loved the story Pirates of the Caribbean. I can't speak for the subsequent films, but everyone really just resonated with that film when it came out, and people still, to this day, still watch Pirates of the Caribbean. What if that first movie tanked, but the second movie was really good? A lot of people are not inclined to watch the second story or the second installment if the first installment wasn't good. What if Peter Jackson just utterly failed Fellowship of the Ring? He would not have had the acclaim with the other 2 movies following it if Fellowship was not good. So I think independent artists and writers, they can also fall into this trap, like, well, I've got this series and I'm just homing in on my skill and stuff like that, and my books, I promise, will be better going forward. It's like, you can roll that dice, but I wouldn't. I would really, really want people to say, that first book was so good. What is going to happen in the second book? So yeah, this has been a stream of rants more than anything. Brian Gilmartin says the first draft is never going to be the best one you write. You often need to rewrite your story more than twice before it really clicks. I'm finding that to be with my book, except my book is going to be 4 to 5 parts, and I've now rewritten the first book for the 3rd time, even though I've only written the second time I rewrote the book. I rewrote the first half of that first book. So really, it's draft 2.5. That's what it is. Final Fantasy fan says, in other words, practice what you preach. Now, I'm not advocating perfectionism either, like, you're gonna always have a better book after you release it, but for it to stick in the culture, especially when people just wanna be distracted by other things instead of reading, yeah, it's very important. It's so important you have a masterpiece. Write masterpieces. That's all I'm gonna say. Professor Geek, my love, says, "New sci-fi writers need to write a history book of their world first." Yeah. Get it out of their system. Realize no one cares about that, and then only include what's relevant to the story in the novel. Yeah, I think that's a really good set of steps. I think, I'm learning this about I'm learning this about my own science fiction writing. I have found that if there's anything I can include in the history of my world, it's gonna be a separate short story. Maybe linked to the overall plot of my saga, or maybe not. Maybe it's because I just really want this part of a piece of fiction in this world. And by writing short stories, I can expand the world that way. And it helps with the lore as well. It helps like, oh, what happened here with this planet and with this history and stuff like that. That's really important because the whole, people call it exposition dump, or maybe they put it in the form of a prologue, but a very long prologue or something like that. And unless the prologue is well written, the prologue should not be used to serve as like, "This is my entire universe." Yeah, Professor Geek also says, "No, but if you give it to book 3, the Wheel of Time series gets really good." It's like, I no. For me, for novels, I actually give it, like, 15 to 20 pages, and if I'm not interested in it, I don't continue with it. Even if it's recommended to me, I'm like, "Sorry, got other things to look at." And then, Brian says, "These new writers never really space out when they speak of their lore. They act like they have to give you everything all at once." That's why I propose, short stories. I can't recommend enough people writing short stories for that kind of stuff, especially for something like science fiction, but even for something like fantasy. Like, explore your world and your lore and your history with characters, with actual characters who may never come back in major stories. But like, okay, explore your world that way and make it digestible like that. And finally, um, I will have to say, I've learned this about myself. I have been getting recommendations for certain works, even in my chat, even in my YouTube channel, that I do appreciate. Like, continue giving me recommendations because I will look at them. But there was a recommendation, a frequent recommendation that I had looked into this last week, and I think I've come to the conclusion after seeing this recommendation that I am just not a reader of space opera. And I've only read or looked at 2 contemporary pieces of space opera. Maybe I would get back into the early pulp fiction of the '60s and '70s or whatever. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Although I've suddenly taken an interest to Solomon Kane, even though he's more fantasy, supernatural, and stuff like that. But I was given the recommendation for the story Star Shatter, and the writing had a very nice flow to it, and I could see where it was really interesting, but and this is just me and my preference. This is not anything of the actual story itself. I don't prefer so much explosive action all at once in one sitting. I love action, but my favorite science fiction so far, guys, and this is just me, I like tension, mystery, introspection, psychology with action in it. So tense scenes. Like, I mean, even 1984 is not like a heavy action piece. It's more very tense scenes. It's almost kind of like, like with film noir, most of the good parts of film noir is like the tension between 2 or 3 characters in a dialogue before actually the gunfire takes place. I like that about science fiction for me. I love psychology, depth, introspection, the weight of the world, the weight of humanity. I love questions. I love things that are just where characters ponder things like, oh, is this right? Should we be doing this? Oh, this isn't right. We should fight this or something like that. Rather than like, you know, have some farmer see some soldiers that just ransacked a village and then like stick a grenade to them like by page 3. Now, I know a lot of people have the appetite for that. So I was looking at Star Shatter, and the writing was fair. It was decent. I just realized it's just not for me. Like I like action. Don't get me wrong. My science fiction will have action, but like let's say actually I can be even so bold to say this, and I'll say this diplomatically and carefully. I can imagine people who absolutely love space opera and high levels of action um, with something like Star Shatter. I can see that audience not prefer my own writing. Like my this kind of audience would have to go through some suspense and conflict and mystery, but action is really not going to take place on the level of Star Wars cantina scene. And so I was thinking is if this is space opera, and this is the normal thing for space opera. I thought I was into space opera. Don't get me wrong, I love Star Wars and I love the EU, but I really do like introspection. For instance, Darth Plagueis, I'm actually preferring that as so far. Like I haven't read a lot of EU, but this is the kind of EU I really, really like. I like the darkness and the weight of this Sith dark force user and contemplation and meditation and premeditation and stuff like that. I love that. I like getting into the psychology of characters. And so my preference for science fiction is actually more on the psychological. There will absolutely be action in my stories and even in my short stories. Um, but not on the level of boom, 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 boom. I've gotta run away, I've gotta fight. I've gotta run away, I've gotta hide, I've gotta fight. Gotta run away again, evade the enemy again. That's fine, but it's definitely not for me. So that is my confession. That is Sound Engraver's confession that I think something like Star Shatter is a very decent read, but I've realized it's just not my preference. But I know there is an appetite and an audience for that as well. So I do want to be careful saying that. All right. Well, did I say what I needed to say? I can do a recap real quick for the science fiction problem. Science fiction problem of today's writers is it's too much world building. You do not need to go to great lengths in your describing the world, no matter how futuristic it is, because you've got a plethora, just decades of all sorts of sci-fi media where even the person who doesn't read science fiction and doesn't watch science fiction, they already know what that looks like. So trust in that, and then trust in the imagination of your readers. Like, oh, okay. Yeah, I know what that looks like. You can just say it in one sentence or two sentences, three sentences, probably no more than that. And if you do need to describe it a lot more, it's only because the protagonist is experiencing it for the first time or experiencing something new. Maybe not for the first time, but experiencing something unfamiliar. As soon as your perspective through the main character is unfamiliar, that's where the writer can divulge a little bit with the description. But even so, I would pare it down. Paring down description in novel writing, I think is a really important trait. I'm finding that out myself. And one tip you can do is Go back to a chapter you haven't seen in months, and you will read it with fresh eyes. You will read it like you forget what you wrote. There are some times where you forget what you write, and it's like, "Oh, what did I mean by that here?" And it's like, "That was way too descriptive over here," or, "That was too confusing in the flow of the narrative here." So, that's where I would warn science fiction writers is just, even in science fiction, even in a very futuristic world, just get through the plot. Get through the plot, have a conflict, establish a conflict, have scenes, have mystery, have some exposition, but really just get through the plot and then please make me interested in your character. And make me not get annoyed when some flirtatious AI is flirting with some character that is very uninteresting. So anyway, that is all. So I think I will wrap it up now. That was nice and short, I think. What is on the dock for my channel not today, this week? um, More SuperCollider probably. I have I don't think you can see it from here, but behind that bureau, I have a rain stick, a very large, very long rain stick, and it has like this really different water sound than I've heard from other rain sticks. And I've been kind of toying with the idea of just like putting that through some delay effect and reverb effect with SuperCollider. If you guys hadn't seen, um, I I published this 10-hour long video of just straight brown noise. Very, very different from just the natural brown noise that SuperCollider generates. I did drop the low end, so, like, brown noise, like, if this is the bandwidth from, uh, 20K to no, yeah, 20K to 20,000K. Is that right? Is my direction right? I don't know. Brown noise actually pretty much cuts off right at, like, 5K, 5 kilohertz. And then I brought the decibel level down so it's, like, really smooth sounding. And a lot of people are liking that. I think people are looking at that video that don't even know what my channel is about because I think it's really soothing for them. So I did actually, post a brown noise video. I might do other videos like that, like pink noise, maybe it's just straightforward pink noise or ocean wave pink noise, but, I've just got a lot of things to do, for just wedding planning, curriculum building, uh, having jobs. And so, commentary is gonna be if I do have any commentary, it's just gonna be snippets of previous live streams and stuff like that. I'll try to do another fresh commentary video probably next weekend, so I have something new that's not SuperCollider, but I don't know. I've been enjoying just hanging out in SuperCollider again and just sharing, what I have with you guys. So that's it for me, just continuing to write and compose and, build a course, an online violin course, and then also plan for the wedding. Music is set. Music has been finalized for the wedding, which is great. But I think I'll end it there. So that's all from me. Until I see you next, keep producing, preserving, and promoting that good music and art that you love.